Okay, hello. Welcome to tonight's presentation from the Relic Department at Central Library and the Prince William Library, Public Library. My name is Kirk Johnson. I'm one of the librarians at Relic, and it's my real pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's presentation. Tonight's presentation is being given by Dr. Peter Henriques. He's a Professor Emeritus from George Mason University and a well-regarded scholar of George Washington, with our first president, with several books and numerous articles to his credit. Tonight, Dr. Henriques will be presenting an excerpt, or speaking on an excerpt from his new book, First and Always, A New Portrait of George Washington. It looks like an excellent book. We're getting some copies in at the library system, including one at Relic, and some more for patrons to check out. And of course, you can also buy yourself a copy at numerous online booksellers and so forth. I've listened to Peter talk about this book already. It's really fascinating. I think you're really going to enjoy it. Just a bit of housekeeping or so forth. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mute everybody except Peter so he can talk. My suggestion for you is to pick on the layout, to pick the side-by-side option. That way you'll have Peter's slideshow and you'll also be able to see him speaking. If you have any questions or any problems during the presentation, use the chat function to get in touch with me, Kirk Johnson. I'll see your messages and I'll reply to you right away and address any issues. And just a heads up, we are recording this presentation, so you will be able to watch it later as well. There will be a YouTube video of this presentation in the near future, in the next few days, and I'll be sure to let everybody know when that's been posted and where you can see it. So with that, that's enough from me. I'm going to turn this over to Peter, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Kirk. Appreciate the nice introduction and enjoyed working with you. I'm sorry I can't look out in the audience and see all of you, but certainly a virtual presentation is better than no presentation at all. You know, I approach my discussions of George Washington basically against the backdrop of three propositions. First, America has never had a leader more important than George Washington. You know, there were two seminal moments in the creation of our great nation: the winning of independence and then the establishment of nationhood. And the two were not the same. But in both of these achievements, it was George Washington that was the crucial and central figure. Really, in essence, if there were no George Washington, there would have been no United States of America. Secondly, as those of you who have heard me speak before, it's no secret that I have great admiration and respect for Washington. Full disclosure, I even wear a medallion of him around my neck. But the third aspect is that, to the degree possible, I seek to understand flesh and blood man, warts and all, and go wherever the evidence leads me. Like all men, Washington had flaws and made mistakes. The story I'm going to share with you tonight illustrates those points. It's based on one of the chapters in my new book, First and Always, as Kirk mentioned. And personally, I think the story has all the elements for an exciting novel, but it's a factual story. I found in studying history, you don't need fiction to make it exciting. The story reminds us of something that we are often likely to forget, namely that the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865 was not our only civil war. In many ways, the American Revolution was America's first civil war, pitting neighbor against neighbor and sometimes family against family in often bloody and cruel conflicts. Parts of the country came what Robert O'Connell, in his very interesting new book, George Washington Revolutionary, calls Dangerland. That term Dangerland can be applied to northern New Jersey. In the aftermath of Washington's victories at Trenton and Princeton, the New Jersey Patriot Militia had forced the Loyalists by the hundred to flee for safety into British-held New York. The refugees, as the Loyalists called themselves, didn't leave willingly and often came back in small guerrilla bands to burn, pillage, or kill. In 1780, George III created a refugee army under the direction of the Board of Associated Loyalists. Interestingly enough, it was headed by William Franklin, Benjamin Franklin's Tory son. And thereafter, the refugees mounted more regular attacks on the New Jersey Patriot towns. Both camps repeated horror stories of rape, mutilation, and murder. Whether they were true or not, it inflamed already embittered feelings. And unfortunately, as we have learned in our own day, what people believe is true can lead to actions which would not be taken if the truth were actually known. Now, there are several characters whose names are very minor figures in history. I just put up so that as I mention them, they'll ring a bell with you in this story. Reprisal and retaliation was the steady diet between the Loyalists and the Patriots. For example, in 1780, a band of the Associated Loyalists, including a determined Tory and former British soldier by the name of Philip White, they raided a Monmouth County, New Jersey home of one John Russell, who was a strong patriot. White's raiders burned the house, wounded Russell, and killed his father, and then slipped over the line to the Haven in New York. However, 2 years later, Philip White was back in Monmouth, New Jersey. Exactly why, we're not sure, perhaps to see his wife. At any event, Patriot militia caught him. Within hours, White was dead. While the accounts vary, apparently he was held back from some other prisoners, robbed, then told he could run for his life, only to be shot down. According to a Loyalist account, his arms had been cut off, his legs broken, his corpse mutilated almost beyond recognition, and shoveled into a makeshift grave. Interesting to note that Russell, whose house White had attacked, was among those present for these events. But one person who was not present was a Patriot militia commander by the name of Joshua Huddy. Joshua Huddy was a highly regarded Patriot leader. He has some questionable personal activities and background, but he was not there. He was working with privateers. It captured by the British in March of 1782, right before this incident, while trying to protect a blockhouse in the little town of Dover. Today it's known as Toms River, New Jersey. And he was imprisoned by the British forces in New York. Well, the Loyalists were outraged. They demanded revenge for the brutal killing of White. And they saw the perfect subject in such a revenge, the local Patriot hero, Captain Joshua Huddy, who had executed Loyalists in the past and whom some erroneously believed was actually responsible for White's death. And some of them, I imagine, felt even if he were not, he's a deserving target in any case. Well, to get their hands on the scoundrel, the Board of Associated Loyalists won permission from the British commanding general of New York, Sir Henry Clinton, to remove Huddy from prison. They took him out under the pretense that he was part of a prisoner exchange. Under the command of the last man on our list here, Captain Richard Lippincott, who, again, just to keep the connection, he was Philip White's brother-in-law. He was the leader. They took Huddy out from prison. And after they took him out from prison at Sandy Hook, they promptly hung him. Warnings were posted on his clothes with the conclusion written in large letters, "Up went Huddy for Philip White." Huddy's compatriots, as you can imagine, were outraged. Here's a marker of Huddy, who died in April of 1782. They demanded vengeance. The news of the outrage quickly spread. And in the heat of the moment, the men of Monmouth delivered an ultimatum to General George Washington. If he would not offer suitable reprisal for Huddy's death, they themselves would. And in so doing, they said, they would open to view a scene at which humanity itself may shudder. Well, the Monmouth ultimatum presented Washington, who was stationed in Newburgh, New York. You can still visit his headquarters today, with a dilemma which in time would cause the general to endure much pain and criticism, a good deal of it self-inflicted. As I've studied Washington, one of his greatest advantages and sources of his greatness was he was a remarkably astute judge of events and characters. But in this case, I believe two key decisions, one of them defendable, the other less so. Indeed, I think he made a major mistake in judgment that triggered the ensuing crisis. Let me explain. Alexander Hamilton, who was eventually a critic of what Washington did, made a point that's worth remembering. And he said this with his almost preternatural wisdom. Hamilton's amazingly wise, and he's still obviously in his early 20s at this time. But he writes, "I know how apt men are to be actuated by the circumstances which immediately surround them, and to be led into an approbation, approval of measures which in another situation they would disapprove of." A good example for us would be the internment of the Japanese Americans during World War II. Basically, now virtually everyone condemns that action. But at the time, it was widely supported. And our story tonight demonstrates that in the morally ambiguous territory of irregular warfare, even an operator as shrewd as George Washington would stumble badly. Now, Washington's instincts led him to be skeptical of retaliation. In one letter to a General Adam Stephen, he said, "Though my indignation at such ungenerous conduct of the enemy might at first prompt me to retaliation, yet humanity and policy forbid the measures. Experience proves that their wanton cruelty injures rather than benefits their cause, that with our forbearance it will justly secure to us the attachment of all good men." Now, I don't mean to imply by citing that quote that the general flatly rejected the idea of retaliation. He certainly did not. As early as 1775, he wrote a letter to General William Howe, where he said the law of retaliation is not only justifiable in the eyes of God and man, but absolutely a duty in which, in our present circumstances, we owe to our relations, friends, and fellow citizens. In a letter to John Hancock in the Continental Congress, Washington said justice and policy will require recourse to be had to the law of retaliation, however abhorrent and agreeable to our natures, in cases of torture and capital punishment. In short, under certain circumstances, Washington supported retaliation. Now, there's no doubt His Excellency was outraged by the murder of Huddy. He was an American officer taken out of a British prison and brutally executed. In perhaps his over-the-top words, he described it as the most wanton, unprecedented, and inhuman murder that ever disgraced the arms of a civilized people. Well, the men of Monmouth were clamoring for action, and the general decided to give it to them. Now, before he acted, Washington, as was his normal course, asked his officers for their opinion. In this case, he actually requested them to write individual written opinions without discussing it among themselves. And in his records, there are reports from 24 different officers. Washington wanted their opinion on whether retaliation should be instituted, and if so, when and how. The response of the officers was overwhelming. They all favored retaliation as justifiable and expedient, both to stop further loyalist atrocities and to keep the people from New Jersey from seeking vengeance on their own, which could lead God knows where. Thus bolstered, Washington sent a brief, almost curt note to his counterpart, General Sir Henry Clinton, who was in charge of the forces at New York. And Washington demanded that Captain Lippincott, the leader of the hanging party, be delivered up to American hands. In failure of it, he added ominously, I shall hold myself justifiable in the eyes of God and man for the measure to which I shall retort. Washington's sharply worded letter stung his counterpart, and Clinton replied, I cannot conceal my surprise and displeasure at the very improper language you have made use of. Clinton described himself as greatly surprised and shocked upon hearing word of Huddy's death. He was blameless for the crime, and he said an inquiry was underway and the perpetrators would be brought to trial. However, Clinton added, no matter what his staff learned about the Huddy case, he had no intention of giving Lippincott or anyone else into Washington's charge. As he put it, violators of the laws of war are best punished by the generals under whose power they act. Discouraged by Clinton's letter, Washington had written Congress of his plans, and early in May, he learned that the members of Congress unanimously approved what he was doing. They were, he was told, deeply impressed with the necessity of convincing the enemies of the United States that repetition of their unprecedented and inhuman cruelties will no longer be suffered with impunity. So Washington is buoyed both by support of his officers and by Congress, and Washington's warning to Clinton was clear. I am under the disagreeable necessity of retaliating as the only means left to put a stop to such inhuman proceedings. And he told Clinton, to save the innocent, you must hand over the guilty. Well, if the guilty party was Captain Lippincott, who was the innocent? And how would he be chosen? Washington's officers had agreed it should be inflicted upon an officer of equal rank. Huddy was a captain, therefore it should be a captain. Preferably a captain not under the convention of surrender, but one who had surrendered at his own discretion. The said captain was to be chosen by lot. Washington tasked General Moses Hazen, who was in charge of the prisoners in Pennsylvania, with the job of finding the appropriate sacrifice. But it soon became clear that Hazen had difficulty finding a captain who had surrendered unconditionally. And when Washington learned this, he then made on his own the crucial decision to pick the unfortunate victim from among a group of 13 British captains who were in Pennsylvania who had surrendered with Cornwallis in October of 1781. Now, although in fairness, it should be noted that many of his officers had suggested that this action be taken. This is the way Washington put it to Hazen in his letter. I'm therefore, since there's no unconditional prisoner available, I am therefore under the disagreeable necessity to direct that you immediately select in the manner before presented from among all the British captains who are prisoner, either under capitulation or convention one of whom is to be sent as soon as possible under regulations and restrictions contained in my former instructions to you. Personally, I find it very hard to defend this decision. Indeed, I really can't think of a much more serious misjudgment by George Washington than this one. When the British surrendered at Yorktown, Washington undoubtedly knew the terms of the surrender agreement. If by some chance he didn't know, he certainly would have soon learned that he violated explicit protections in the surrender of articles. Article 14 of the capitulation terms ensured that all those surrendering were protected against any form of retaliation or reprisal. And it seems to me that a fair question really could be asked. Could Washington hang any man whom he had pledged his own country, his own and his country's honor to protect? And as we'll see, in the strange ways of fate, a man chosen by lot would ensure that any such retaliatory hanging would not go unnoticed by the world at large. The mechanism for choosing the sacrificial victim was a macabre lottery, full of the kind of drama that one could have in a TV miniseries or film. This is the way it worked. On Monday, May 27th, these 13 captains were taken to Black Bear Inn in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And there, 2 sets of paper slips were put in 2 separate baskets. Slips in the first basket bore the names of the 13 captains. The second basket also held 13 slips, 12 blank slips, one bearing the chilling message, "Unfortunate." Because the officers had refused to participate in what they firmly believed to be an illegal proceeding, a drummer boy was called upon to draw a slip from the first basket, call the name of the captain, and then take a slip from the second basket. You can imagine how the men waited. There is one letter from one of the 13 captains, not asking, to his mother, just how what terror was in his mind, thinking what might befall him in a matter of moments. 10 times the drummer boy called names, 10 times he drew blanks. The 11th name was that of Captain Charles Asgill, the youngest of the 13 captains, only 19 years old. Asgill this is obviously a later portrait of him. He was with the 1st Regiment of Foot Guards since enlisting at age 16. He actually went to America against his father's wishes. He was his parents' only son. His pro-American father, Charles, had been Lord Mayor of London. His mother was Sarah Teresa, Lady Asgill, was of a wealthy Huguenot emigre family. In other words, they are a very important family. The drummer boy now reached into the second basket. I think you know what's coming. The slip he selected read, "Unfortunate." The sight of his fate nearly unmanned Asgill. His commanding officer, Major James Gordon, steadied him, saying, "For God's sakes, don't disgrace your colors." Once the action was initiated to mollify the fury of the Monmouth patriots, it seemed proper that the victim be held within the lines of the New Jersey state troops, close under the eyes of those who demanded his blood. And Asgill, accompanied by Major Gordon, who befriended him throughout the ordeal and actually did everything humanly possible to stop the approaching tragedy, was ultimately transported to Timothy Day's Tavern in Chatham, New Jersey, to await his execution. British were understandably outraged at Washington's actions. They all virtually condemned the murder of Huddy. As one of them expressed it, Washington had determined to revenge upon some innocent man the guilt of a set of lawless banditti. Alexander Hamilton agreed with them. Hamilton wrote, I think, the most impressive letter critiquing what was going on in this particular incident. Some of you might remember from about Hamilton, he would forcefully oppose the manner of executing another British officer, Major John Andre, in the Benedict Arnold treason plot. In that case, Hamilton knew that Andre's life could not be spared, but Hamilton believed the manner of taking it by hanging him rather than shooting him was an act of rigid justice. But in Hamilton's mind, the Asgill affair was a very different nature. As he expressed it in a letter, a sacrifice of this sort is entirely repugnant to the genius of the age we live in. And it's without example in modern history, nor can it fail to be considered in Europe as wanton and unnecessary. If we wreak our resentment on an innocent person, it will be suspected that we are too fond of executions. I'm persuaded it will have an influence peculiarly unfavorable to the general's character. He wrote that letter to Washington, but sent it via Henry Knox, the hopes that it would have an impact. No doubt, Washington was chagrined by the course of the events, and he was certainly sympathetic to the plight of poor Asgill, who, like Major Andre, was an extremely appealing individual who won the admiration of General Hazen and other American officers. Washington quickly confessed to a friend, General Lincoln, that the incident has distressed me exceedingly. Nevertheless, Washington felt compelled to justify his original decision as the proper one. My son Greg, who's a psychology professor at James Madison, describes man as the justifying animal. We bend over backwards to justify that what we do is the right thing to do. Having made his choice, I think Washington clutched hard at his decision. Here are some letters, were his own words from 3 different letters. Having formed my opinion upon the most mature reflection and deliberation, I can never recede from it. Or again, the enemy ought to have learned before this that my resolutions are not to be trifled with. Or in a third example, my resolutions, having been taken up upon the most mature deliberation, supported by the approbation of Congress, grounded in the general concurrence of all the principal officers of the Army who were particularly consulted on the subject, cannot be receded from. Justice to the Army and public, my own honor, and I think I may venture to say universal benevolence, require them to be carried out into full execution. For the general to argue that universal benevolence demanded that he execute an officer that was protected under the terms of surrender that he had accepted at Yorktown, I think it demonstrates just how far Washington felt himself compelled to go to assure himself that he was correct. I think, in essence, he was trapped by an inability to recognize that he made a mistake. Probably at one level, he soon realized he was vulnerable to criticism. But he didn't know how to successfully backtrack from such an explicit assurance that he'd given his word that he would carry through with earlier threats. In this letter that I quoted from Hamilton, Hamilton said, in this case, it's better to be inconsistent than to be consistent and do the wrong thing by being consistent. Certainly, Washington hoped to avoid executing Asgill, but he convinced himself he could not retreat publicly without doing even greater damage and harm to the American cause by weakening his ability to lead, because people would feel that they could no longer trust what he said he would do, he would do. Any chance of Captain Lippincott being turned over to the Americans, or at least punished by the British, ended when a court-martial found him innocent. Using a defense that many later generations were to know, his lawyers convinced the general court-martial that Lippincott had been merely following orders. His actions was not the effect of malice or ill will, according to the conclusion, but proceeded from a conviction that it was his duty to obey the orders of the board of the directors of Associated Loyalists. In the aftermath of this decision, but also because the British condemned the action strongly, they did do away with the board of directors for the Loyalists, and they promised further investigation. It may well be that the new British commander, Sir Guy Carleton, who replaced Clinton, might have deliberately proposed further investigation as a way of delaying things. Washington wants to delay things now, and he decides to bump the question of what to do up to the Continental Congress. Washington, in applying to Congress, said the case has become, quote, a great national concern upon which an individual ought not to decide. He thus requested Congress, quote, to chalk a line for me to walk. If Asgill were in fact to be sacrificed, Congress would make the final decision, and not General Washington. Now, why was the matter a great national concern, and indeed expanding it into an international cause célèbre, was mainly due to Lady Asgill, who had enough influence to arouse an international outcry. A little bit like when Koschiegi was killed, if his connection to the Washington Post allowed for attention that would not have come otherwise. The public prints of Europe were, according to a Baron von Grimm's journal, the public print all over Europe resounded with the unhappy catastrophe. It interested every feeling mind, and the first question asked of all vessels that arrived from any port in North America was always an inquiry into the fate of that young man. Does Asgill still live? Now, young Asgill was a thoroughly sympathetic character whose qualities and charms were perfect for France at this time. And as events developed, Asgill's salvation, and really, in a sense, Washington's, would come from France. Lady Asgill wrote a moving and what proved to be a very effective letter to the French Foreign Minister, Vergenes, who had the ear of the king. I want to read the letter. Perhaps it's a little too flowery for modern ears, but it gives you a sense of the time and her own appeal on behalf of her son. My son, my only son, dear to me as he is brave, amiable as he is beloved, only 19 years of age. Actually, he was 20, but it sounded better having him 19. A prisoner of war in consequence of the capitulation of Yorktown, is at present confined in America as an object of reprisal. Figure to yourself, shall the innocent share the fate of the guilty? Figure to yourself, sir, the situation of a family in these circumstances, surrounded as I am with objects of distress, bowed down by fear and grief, words are wanting to express what I feel and to paint such a scene of misery. My husband, given over by his physician some hours before the arrival of this news, not in a condition to be informed of it. My daughter, attacked by a fever, accompanied with delirium, speaking of her brother in tones of wildness and without interval of reason, unless it be to listen to some circumstance which may console her heart. Let your sensibility, sir, paint to you my profound, my inexpressible misery, and plead in my favor. A word from you, like a voice from heaven, would liberate us from dissolution, from the last degree of misfortune. I know how far General Washington reveres your character. Tell him only that you wish my son restored to liberty, and he will restore him to his desponding family. He will restore him to happiness. The virtue of my and courage of my son will justify this act. Well, powerful words. But there were other reasons, in addition to Lady Asgill's letter, that caused France to tilt Asgill's way. They, too, were a signatory to the surrender that Washington had accepted at Yorktown. In that sense, Asgill was France's prisoner as well as America. And the French general, Rochembeau, unburdened himself to the French minister in the United States in a letter that the minister was to share with Washington, but not put it in the official record. And Rochembeau explained to Washington he was sure Washington did not want to soil Cornwallis's honorable capitulation by a deed of reprisal that we have no right to commit, which Europeans would regard as a barbarous injustice. Rochambeau later said that Washington, while unwilling to recant publicly, assured him in private that Asgill would not perish by his order. No doubt, Washington's preference by now was that Asgill not be executed. On October 7th, he wrote his good friend, General Benjamin Lincoln, "If I had to give my private opinion respecting Asgill, I should pronounce in favor of his being released from his duress, that he should be permitted to go to his friends in Europe." And he explained to Rochambeau that he had given Asgill leave to travel quite widely on parole, indeed allowed him to go all the way up to the territory almost controlled by the British and their headquarters in New York. You wonder whether Washington had hoped that Asgill would take advantage of his chance and simply escape to New York City. In a sense, by doing so, Asgill might save Washington's honor by violating his own. But Asgill's own sense of honor did not allow him to choose that option. Lady Asgill's letter turned out to be the key to solving the dilemma. Vergenes was moved by it and by reasons of state as well. And Vergenes, therefore, after the letter, he sent the letter along to King Louis XVI. And Louis XVI and also Marie Antoinette both were touched by the letter, told Vergenes to write Washington that The king and queen would be very pleased if Washington could show mercy in this particular case. Well, needless to say, the general needed no persuading. Seeing a possible solution to the crisis, Washington sent the letter to Congress by courier. It literally arrived in the nick of time. Indeed, the crisis ended with a moment of high drama, once again more fitting for a novel or a film than for real life. Finally, Congress, after all, slow to operate, was ready to direct that Asgill be executed. And they decided to call the question on the morning of October 30th, 1782. There were a few members believing with Hamilton that this would be a bad mistake and a blot on the country's honor, tried to delay it. But the clear majority favored executing him. By the way, it might be interesting that Hamilton's description of the Congress might have a modern ring to some of you. Hamilton said that 3/4 of the members of Congress were enemies of talent, and 3/4 of the remaining 1/4 had contempt for integrity. That gets you down to 1 out of 12 good guys. Happily, almost miraculously, before the vote could be taken, Washington's letter conveying the desire of the French sovereigns arrived. Suddenly, there was a solution that would not seem like backing down in the face of protest from the hated British. Asgill could be freed as a gift of France, for whom attitude, of course, ran very high. Congress voted unanimously that Asgill's life, quote, should be given as a compliment to the King of France. He was ordered freed and sent home. And thus the crisis ended. As one of the representatives from New Jersey put it, we got clear of shedding of an innocent blood by a wonderful interposition of Providence just in the nick of time. In more mundane terms, Robert Livingston noted, Captain Asgill would have certainly paid the forfeit for the injustices of his countrymen had not the intervention of their majesties prevented them. Washington was happily able to write Asgill with the good news. As good news for Washington as it was for Asgill. But there was to be an unsettling footnote to the affair, which caused the general additional discomfort. Apparently, in time, Asgill began to complain that he had been treated poorly while a prisoner under Washington's control. And one of Washington's greatest admirers, Tench Tillman, Sr., the father of Washington's very excellent aide, informed the general how his name was being traduced abroad. Tillman reported that among other insults, Asgill had declared that gallows had been erected before his prison window as a taunt regarding his upcoming fate. Actually, Asgill later wrote that no gallows was ever placed outside his prison. He did report that he was told that there was one in Monmouth with the sign, "Up goes Asgill" for Huddy, as it had been "Up goes Huddy" for White. And perhaps unfairly, Asgill believed that his mistreatment was countenanced by the general himself, whom Asgill believed was inclined to execute him if it had not been for the intervention of the French. A part of Washington's character structure was that he was notoriously thin-skinned, especially on matters that cast a pall on him as a man of honor. For Washington consistently strove to be viewed as a man of unselfish virtue and unyielding honor. And any attacks hurt him deeply. Jefferson perceptibly noted, Washington feels these things, Jefferson said, more than any man he ever knew. Always striving to be the epitome of knightly virtue and magnanimity. The general angrily responded that he was convinced that history would make clear that Dutch calumnies had no validity. It was particularly distressing that Asgill himself was apparently the source of these calumnies. If true, Washington declared that his earlier positive view of the youth was forfeited because Asgill had to know the charges were not true. Washington rhetorically asked, how did Asgill explain the continual indulgences and procrastinations he'd experienced? How did he think he was allowed, for the benefit of his health and the recreation of his mind, to ride into the surrounding country for many miles with his friend and companion, Major Gordon, constantly attending him? Washington made clear these things could only happen with his permission. In fact, now the more he thought of it, Washington came to the conclusion maybe Asgill might not have been the gentleman that Washington initially thought he was. He remembered an early indication. After receiving Washington's letter freeing him, Asgill did not do the polite and proper thing and write the letter to the general thanking him for his kind treatment. As Washington expressed it, I was not without suspicions after the final liberation and return of Captain Asgill to New York that his mind had been improperly impressed or that he was defective in politeness. Two things struck me in reading Washington's reaction to Asgill's charges. One was that in justifying his actions as being very lenient, the general temporarily forgot that in the middle of the crisis, he himself had rejected such a policy. To quote him, I am informed that Captain Asgill is at Chatham without guard and under no constraint. This, if true, is certainly wrong. I wish to have the young gentleman treated with all tenderness possible, consistent with his present situation. But until his fate is determined, he must be considered as a close prisoner and kept in the greatest security. I request, therefore, he be sent immediately to the Jersey line, where he should be kept a close prisoner in perfect security till further orders. Now, the second point of surprise is that Washington could have seriously expected a thank you note from Asgill and be hurt at not receiving one. Let's look at it from Captain Asgill's perspective. And happily, thanks to the efforts of Anne Umundson in England, a 16-page letter that Asgill wrote in 1786 has just recently been published in the Lancaster County Historical Journal, which allows us to get a better look at it from his perspective. Think of it. He is a young officer that surrendered under explicit protections against any reprisal. Then, as a result of Washington's direct orders, he was chosen to be executed for something he was completely innocent of doing, held for a time in close confinement, denied mail from his family, often tormented by angry patriots, and on occasion physically abused, forced to wonder whether each day would be his last on earth, having to perform the painful task of writing to his ill father, asking for his forgiveness for disobeying him, and instead answering the call to serve king and country. And while writing the letter, fully expecting that he would be dead by the time his father received it. As for not thanking Washington for not hanging him, Asgill confessed, my judgment told me that I could not with sincerity return thanks, which my feeling would not allow me to give vent to. Just an ending word on Asgill and what happened to him. He rose in the ranks to become General Asgill. He served in Ireland during the rebellion of 1798. There he was to oversee the execution of a dashing Irish rebel named William Farrell. However, his wife, Lady Sophia Asgill, argued that since Queen Marie Antoinette petitioned to General George Washington had saved Asgill's life, Asgill was duty bound to do the same at her request and save Farrell's life, a request he honored. Asgill ultimately died in 1823, 40 years after his near execution. The Asgill affair could have ended up being a very severe blot on George Washington's reputation. Asgill's death would have been a permanent stain that would have not easily washed away. Now, I don't doubt that General Washington always acted in what he believed was the best interest of his country. The brutal and unlawful murder of Joshua Huddy presented him with a difficult dilemma. Public opinion was overwhelmingly in favor of a tough response. If Washington had not threatened retaliation, he might have lost control of the situation. But in doing so, he committed himself to a dangerous course. And once committing himself, he found it impossible to reverse himself for fear that inconsistency would damage his ability to lead. Needing a victim, he somehow convinced himself that executing a convention prisoner was justified, even though he felt increasing anguish over the course of events. Looking for a way out, Washington wisely bought time, pushed the issue up to Congress, and quickly and gratefully took the way out offered by Vergenes' letter. Placed against the remarkable achievements that General George Washington accomplished in winning our war for independence, the Asgill affair is a minor blip. It reminds us that even the greatest of men are mortal and they can make mistakes. Thanks to a mother's love and her ability to write moving letters, the potentially tragic aspects of the mistake were mitigated, and Americans were spared the challenge of explaining why General George Washington had executed a man he had promised to protect from any such retaliation. Thank you very much.